Hi, everybody. Ali, if you want to bring me back on screen. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. My name is Omar Aziz. I'm the director for the Middle Eastern Student Center. We really appreciate you all taking some time today to join us for our speaker series. We're very excited for our guests today and to have a conversation with them about some of their work that they've been doing. So first, want to just welcome Dr. Sunaina Maira to this event. And so for those of you that don't know, the Middle Eastern Student Center is at UC Riverside, and it's a space for students who identify as Middle Eastern, North African, Swana from the region, to come together and find community. So we really wanted to bring Dr. Sunaina Maira here today to talk about her book, The 9/11 Generation. And Dr. Maira is a professor at UC Davis, currently in the Department of Asian American Studies. And she's written some amazing books and has many awards, and her bio's up on social media, so you can take a look over there. And I want to make sure we have time to speak with Dr. Maira today, and just wanted to kind of welcome you to everybody that's here, and also just kind of give you a little bit of why we decided to bring Dr. Maira. One of the things that so those of you that may or may not know, that I am a researcher and doing a PhD candidate doing research on Afghan Americans. And one of the things that I always came across was that I just could never find anything related to that community, related to folks that identify as Afghan American. And so Dr. Maira's book, The 9/11 Generation, was one of the few studies that I was able to find. And as somebody from the Bay Area who grew up there and grew up in Fremont, California, and Ali Sadat, our program coordinator, likes to joke that you're from the Bay Area when you always have to talk about it. So I'm going to do it now and just mention how I read Dr. Maira's work and was just so impressed by how well she captured the experience for folks that identify as Muslim, South Asian, Arab, and Afghan in that community, and how well you were able to bring that to life and to kind of share that experience. So welcome, Dr. Maira. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored by that introduction. And it's very humbling to hear that from an Afghan brother, that you feel that I actually, captured something of your experience. But I will agree with you. I think there's not enough work on Afghan Americans, which is why your work, Omar, is so important. And I'm so excited about it. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for organizing this, and to Ali as well.
Thank you. So we'll just go ahead and get started. And Ali Sadat is on the side. He's on the chat. If you all need anything, if you need to message Ali any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to him directly if you have questions. We're also streaming this on YouTube. So if you have friends or know anybody that wants to join over there, feel free to have them take a look through YouTube at the MESC UCR account. So Dr. Maira, if it's okay, we'll just go ahead and begin. So your book is called The 9/11 Generation. And what, can you talk a little bit about who you focused on in that book, and why then?
Yeah. I actually, I'm really struck, by the way, Omar, that people, are still sort of grappling with this term, the 9/11 generation, and still, wanting to discuss that book. As this is actually, 20 years later, there is still such a need, it seems, or 30 years, we still seem to be grappling with some of these issues. At the time that I was working on the book, which was actually between 2007 and 2011, while I was teaching at UC Davis and living in the Bay Area, I noticed that my students, many of them obviously, had grown up entirely in this post 9/11 era. And obviously, everyone here has, but the generation that was actually, in middle school or in high school, and that actually came of age at that time, was a very important generation. And I want to flag two things. One is that using the term the 9/11 generation means using a generational concept or an age-based category. So we tend to have terms such as the baby boomer generation or the 60s generation and so on, right? But I think that the way in which 9/11 got attached as a signifier to the concept or category of generation suggested that there was something very specific about that experience. And as a youth studies scholar, what I was concerned about was, what was it like to actually go through adolescence or young adulthood, at a time in which the enemy of the state was defined as being Muslim, Arab, or Middle Eastern, and in some cases South Asian, knowing that your community was being subjected to surveillance and homeland communities overseas were being subjected to invasion and occupation. The war in Afghanistan is the longest war in US modern history. And yet this war was given so little attention relative, sadly, even to the wars in Iraq and then the war in Yemen. And so I was very kind of both concerned, worried, and also interested to understand what marked the identifications of that category. And that category, in a sense, could be elastic. It can expand to anybody who's grown up in that post 9/11 era, because we're in this permanent war on terror, it seems.
Yeah, and I think that was part of why, I think this book really resonated with me. I was a freshman in high school when 9/11 happened, and so it was, I think for so many of us that grew up in that generation, it was just like such a formative experience for us, and really shaped and reshaped the way we engaged politics in so many ways. And so I love the way that your book has been able to kind of dissect that and dig through that. And you one of the things you mentioned, you kind of broke it up by South Asian, Arab, and Afghan, and like in a lot of the way that you were writing about it. Is a particular reason why you use that particular sort of grouping together versus any other other groupings that may also exist?
Right. That was because Omar, as an ethnographer, I was interested in documenting the experiences of Muslim American college students in the Bay Area. And so the communities that I was studying were specifically either South Asian or Arab or Afghan. I want to note that I wasn't able to do research with the Iranian American community. If I had, I would have had to expand that string of terms or use a broader category. And so I know we might get to this later, but I think this is relevant to your question right now too, which is that the whole question of categorization is kind of part of the issue. Like the crux of the matter is how these communities got named. And so, people were starting to use terms like AMEMSA in the Bay Area, right? Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian, or MASA, which was, Middle Eastern, Arab, South Asian, to try to find an inclusive category. But what I also have to acknowledge is all inclusive categories are ultimately always exclusive or exclusionary in some way, right? And so if we don't include North African, then where did they fit? Because what if you're North African, but you're not Muslim identified and you're not Arab? So all of these questions are really kind of tangled. And so I decided for a very simple kind of numeration. It was very important for me to include Afghan Americans as a discrete category because they do fall between the cracks. And I think that subsuming them under Muslim American, doesn't necessarily work for everyone, but also, they're not Middle Eastern, obviously. And so, if we don't say Southwest Asian or Central Asian, it means that, they are actually, often disappear. But I'm also very cognizant of the fact that, even in that list of terms that I'm using, some are racial terms and some are geographic, right? And some are religious and some are, we're also moving between area studies categories, which we need to be kind of like, wary of anyway, right? So who defines Central Asia in research, right? I mean, Cold War experts, or who defines South Asia and whether Afghanistan fits or doesn't fit. So I try to explore some of this in that book, but those were the three communities I was doing field work with.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it was, we've been having a lot of those discussions on, on our campus too, and just trying to figure out, what does make the most sense. How sometimes you're kind of forced to categorize in these ways, but what is the way that makes the most sense for the communities that we serve. So I wanted to kind of pinpoint on that because I thought it was a really interesting note. And you spent some time in your book discussing those different categories that exist and why some are good, some are, they all have issues with them. And so I enjoyed reading a little bit about that. So so based on based on your experiences and the studies that you did, how did you see 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror like change the way this generation, that particular generation, engaged in politics? What are some of the ways that you saw that?
Yeah, I think there were two broad trends that I identified in the book, and then there were some specific issues in each of those. And one was a move towards coalition building amongst these groups. So precisely along the lines that we identified, people trying to cross ethnic and racial boundaries and national groupings to try to create new categories. So coming up with these coalitional labels, which were new in many cases. MEMSA did not exist, before the early 2000s, or MESA on my campus. The framework that has been used is Middle Eastern and South Asian. And so I think that the formation of coalitions, which was particularly spurred by that generation, I think it was in the younger generation that people were trying to make these kinds of cross-ethnic alliances around to organize. So it was specifically driven, these were labels that were driven by political organizing. I should also kind of flag in passing, I didn't mention this earlier, that the term SWANA, one of the first instances that I was aware of, SWANA being used in the Bay Area was by a group of queer Southwest Asians and North Africans, which was also, in, I think even before 2001, SWANABAC was a group which I think has since dissolved. So I think there's also, an interesting intersection of like queer organizing and collectivities, and then, all the other groups we're talking about. But I think in terms of the shift in politics, so in addition to that kind of cross-ethnic solidarity, obviously there was a real intensification of pan-Islamic solidarity and pan-Muslim organizing. And many young people who faced with this kind of onslaught of really virulent Islamophobia, really kind of affirming, often very publicly and visibly, their Muslim identification and being drawn into creating pan-Islamic coalitions or umbrellas. And so in the book, I identified these two axes of political responses to 9/11. So one was, this cross-ethnic solidarity, which also extended to communities outside, right? So with Asian and Pacific Islander American communities or African-American communities, who of course are already part of the Muslim community. The second axis of political mobilization was, pan-Islamic mobilization. So the real spurt in Muslim civil rights activism is something that I discussed in a chapter in the book. But I think in general, obviously what I saw was this greater turn to political engagement across generations, not just in the younger generation, and a lot of young people wanting to go into issues of civil rights or the law or human rights organizing because of that experience.
And you talk about how how 9/11 sort of shaped a lot of what how these folks engage in politics. And oftentimes we talk about Islamophobia and how that is something that came after 9/11. And but you point out how that is actually part of a much longer sort of phenomenon. So could you talk a little bit more about and sometimes we think, and I get into this of like, everything's happened. There was no, everything happened after 9/11. Islamophobia, like, everything was great before that. Mm-hmm. And it was just sort of 9/11 happened, and that's where it occurred. But there's a much longer history of that. So could you talk a little bit more about the longer history of those issues facing Muslim Americans and folks that identify from those regions?
Absolutely. That's a very crucial point, Omar. And thank you for bringing that up, because I do feel my students, especially, like if they've heard the term Islamophobia at all, or even sometimes my colleagues, fellow academics who think this is just really a post 9/11 phenomenon. And I think it is important to remember first that the term Islamophobia wasn't always around. And, I think when Edward Said was, writing in the late 1970s, talking about Islamophobia, we have to keep in mind that, the moment in which this really crystallized, particularly in the US media and in the public imaginary, was in response to the Iranian hostage crisis of the late 1970s. And so I do think it's really crucial to remember how much the conflation of Iran and Islam and, kind of US national security has been really congealed in the US public imagination. And this is ongoing. We see the way in which Iran is the permanent primal enemy of the United States. But I think, in the early 80s, there was actually a report in the UK, the Runnymede Trust report, which actually really tried to define the term Islamophobia. There are people who kind of disagree with this term, and we can have this conceptual discussion later on, and prefer to use the term anti-Muslim racism instead for a variety of reasons. But I think the point here is that, in the transition from the Cold War to what we have now come to call the war on terror, there was a shift in defining the main threat to US national security and US strategic interests in foreign policy overseas from being communist to being the Muslim, right? And so I think that transition from the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union in 1989, to, the war on terror represented the ways in which, the US, the Pentagon, the CIA decided that, in order to maintain US hegemony, this threat that constantly needed to be manufactured to kind of, present the US and position it as always being under siege and always needing to fight wars, overseas to protect itself, shifted from being the figure of the communist to being the figure of the Islamist. Now, Afghanistan was the hinge case. Afghanistan is where the Cold War ended and the war on terror began. That's why I feel like it is such an important site to understand the workings of US empire. And that's also why it's not discussed, because if you look at Afghanistan, you understand the workings of US power and why US policy shifted from, basically collaborating with the Mujahideen to then, trying to slaughter the Mujahideen. There's also a second issue, which is that I just want to mention this since you are at Riverside, in theory, you're all based in SoCal, which is the case of the LA 8 in 1987. This case, which was, involved the prosecution of 7 Palestinian activists and 1 Kenyan ally, is known as the case of the LA 8. And it's a case in which the US government tried to deport these Palestinian activists for their activism in relation to Palestine. They were all Marxists, interestingly. So for me, the case of the LA 8 is very important. Yeah, I know people don't know about this case because, you're not going to learn about it, in general in, US history. But, the point is that they represent the kind of convergence of Cold War era policies of deporting activists to the anti-Muslim and anti-Arab policies, because they were Arab, some of them were Muslim, and they were Marxist. And so for me, that's a very interesting case, which often doesn't get discussed, because this is kind of was the double whammy of the kind of transition in US, policing and surveillance. And so it seems to me that, the term Islamophobia, sometimes it does not completely capture the range of racial formations that are involved, which also include political racism. So there are people who may not be Muslim or who may not identify as Muslim, but who are still caught in the dragnet of Islamophobia, right? So Sikh Americans, for example, turban Sikh males in particular, or other, people who are misrecognized or identified as Muslim. The other thing, I'll just say one last comment on this question, because I think it's an important one to note, which is that there are also scholars who talk about the ways in which Arabophobia, for example, often dovetails with Islamophobia, but is not actually discussed as much, including in ethnic studies, until the work of Stephen Salaita and previously the work of Ella Shohat and other scholars who try to point out that underlying Islamophobia is Arabophobia and underlying Arabophobia is Islamophobia, and the two are really interlocking.
Yeah, and I love that you sort of, I think it was really helpful for me to understand, how you make that connection between the Cold War to the war on terror. And it's just sort of this continuation that has been existing for decades now. And it just makes so much more sense when I think about the connections to, US policy, empire, imperialism, and how that's just, the target is different, but a lot of the tactics can be very similar. And so we just kind of have a different face to that. So that comparison, that sort of trajectory, I think made a lot of sense for me when you first introduced it. I wanted to talk a little bit about, what are the specific issues? So you when working with a lot of these, youth, what were the specific issues that youth were that they were most engaged in? What are the types of things that these folks were engaging in politically?
Right. So, thinking about that period, which was kind of the mid 2000s, I mean, I had started getting interested in these questions during the war in Iraq. And so, of course, a lot of these young people, when I was interviewing them, in the mid 2000s, had become politically engaged through involvement in anti-war protests, but also in ongoing involvement in the Palestine solidarity movement. And I realized that, Palestine was such an important site of politicization and, sort of forming of political identity for this generation. So, I mean, it's just like every couple of years, there's another massacre in Gaza, and people sort of mobilize in response to that. Also in 2004 and 2005, we had the launching of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement from Palestine. A lot of young people got involved in what's called the BDS movement. And then there was also, of course, I think very muted but still, active engagement with protests against the war in Afghanistan, which I think relatively, was much weaker in the United States than protests against the war in Iraq for a variety of reasons. But, I did talk about some of the protests in Fremont that I went to during those years. And then, of course, really kind of like massive concern with civil rights violations during the war on terror and, the targeting of Muslim American communities for surveillance and detention and deportation. There is one thing that I really do want to mention, because again, this is a fact that is disappearing from our collective memory. But in 2001 and 2002, there was a program, a federal program called special registration, because, everything to do with Muslims is really special. And so they were rounded up, Muslim immigrant males between the ages, of 18 and 23 from 24 different Muslim majority countries were actually required to register with the government. As a result of that program, about 15,000 men were actually deported for immigration violations. 0 of them were found to be linked to terrorism, but it was a mass intelligence gathering campaign. There was a huge, outcry. There was a lot of hue and cry about this from civil liberties groups, and the program was canceled. But we must not forget that Muslim Americans in this country were actually one of the few groups since World War II and the rounding up of Japanese Americans in concentration camps to be required to register for the government purely on the basis of their religion and their national origin. And so the Muslim ban is just the latest in a series of programs that have targeted specific Muslim communities in this country because of US national security interests. And so there was mobilization also against special registration that these young people were engaged in. And so in the book, I talk about 3 forms of political engagement, engagement, around the question of civil rights, engagement around the questions of human rights, and then some engagement around the question of women's rights, and LGBTQ or queer rights is also discussed in the group, in the book, as being part of these movements during the culture wars.
And out of these movements, we've seen coalitions and sort of some new identities sort of form. So could you talk about those coalitions? And I know you touched on it a little bit, but what are those new things that sprung up from these from the people engaging in these issues?
Right. So that is very important because I think this is an ongoing topic. And I feel like there's been a kind of resurgence of interest in this, amongst my students, for example, during Black Lives Matter protests, similar questions about, how to create coalitions. And so at the time, I think, there was really a lot of grappling with how to come together across ethnic boundaries to connect communities that hadn't always been collaborating together, like Arabs and South Asians, for example. I mean, I think that coalition was, particularly important after 9/11. It was not one that had actually existed before. But along with the coalitions, Omar, I do want to point out there was also fracturing. So, for example, as someone, who is Indian myself, one of the things I noticed is the ways in which Indian Muslims were being cordoned off from Indian Hindus, and that in fact there were tensions and there were divisions, amongst those who are South Asian Muslims and those who are non-Muslim South Asians, which is of course part of the politics of, Hindu nationalism as well in the Indian diaspora. But in terms of the coalitions, I mean, one of the things that I also want to point out is there were coalitions, created between, let's call them Swana communities and non-Swana communities on the basis of civil rights. So new efforts being made by, Muslim American activists or by Arab American activists with those engaged with, civil rights, but also with the anti-war movement. So in the case of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also in the case of Palestine, there have been these kind of, ongoing connections that people have tried to make on the basis of opposition to US warfare and to US imperialism. And so I talk a lot in the book about also the question of interfaith coalition building and the ways in which different communities that were Muslim, Christian, Jewish, were trying to come together to have discussions about Islamophobia. And I think one of the responses to Islamophobia has been this interfaith project. And there's been a lot of writing on it since, but at the moment that I was doing it, there was a real push, including, it must be noted, from the state, from the US government, to create interfaith coalitions as the proper mode of coalition building in response to 9/11. In some cases, what this meant was there was a faith washing of US imperialism. And rather than talking about, US national security, US hegemony, the military industrial complex, the occupation in Palestine, instead, this was sort of converted to a problem of religious tolerance or intolerance. Like either if only Muslims could be more tolerant or non-Muslims could be more tolerant of Muslims, then all of these problems would be solved, right? Including the problem of why they hate us, which was the kind of right-wing response to 9/11. But I think the Interfaith Project, as I'm sort of like already kind of hinting, has its limitations because there were certain issues and questions that were off the table. And the students in the book that I interviewed, many of them were already getting frustrated with the ways in which they were being censored in these spaces, which tended to be the liberal pluralism, liberal, interfaith solidarity, and wanting to go beyond questions of just thinking about, a more religious understanding to also thinking about the political questions.
Yeah, that was something that, I've started to notice too. A lot of, and a lot of the issues around civil rights and, activism within our community, a lot of the institutions have been faith-based. And so that's definitely something that I've observed as well. So I think that that's a interesting sort of phenomenon that we've seen. But it has its limitations, like you said. There are a lot of folks that are going to feel left out and not be able to feel fully engaged or be able to participate in that when it's sort of based around faith. Um, can you mention a little bit about the sort of are there new ethnic or racial identities that were formed as a result? And you also talked about how you saw more people identifying through their faith, like choosing their maybe their religious faith over their maybe ethnic or racial identity. So could you talk a little bit about why you think that may have happened and what was the cause?
Sure. And one thing I should clarify, Omar, is that I think that my concern with the Interfaith Project as kind of the best response to the war on terror is not only that some people are excluded, is that some questions and issues get excluded, like in the liberal institutionalized version of this interfaith dialogue and, interfaith harmony and so on. There was a depoliticization of the issues. And, I think that is my concern. While, it's very valid, obviously to use faith as a basis for collectivity and community building. In terms of the emphasis on different ethnic identities, and then the experience of some in kind of like prioritizing their Muslim identification over their ethnic and national or racial identification, this definitely was something that many researchers and also community leaders and activists were noticing after 9/11, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I think this is a response to Islamophobia, clearly, like, if these identities are under attack, people as a means of resistance would definitely want to affirm that and, kind of really publicly proclaim that identity. I think what I was kind of also curious about after looking at some of the work that was being done in Europe, as well as being done with different, for example, South Asian Muslim communities, such as work on Bangladeshi diasporic communities by Nazli Kibria and on Arab communities by Nadine Naber, is a phenomenon that at the time was labeled Muslim first, Arab second, or Muslim first, Bangladeshi second. What that analysis, was basically pointing out was a finding that the young people in that generation, particularly the 9/11 generation, who really felt it was important to emphasize pan-Islamic solidarity and de-emphasize ethnic identity. So it was not just about prioritizing pan-Islamic solidarity, over ethnic and racial identification as being more important for the reasons I mentioned, or even navigating both, holding both in play at the same time, switching between them, but really, sort of some people feeling that in fact it was not appropriate to emphasize ethnic or racial identity and seeing that as actually being divisive. And, this is a long kind of argument in many societies, the tension between pan-Islamic solidarity and nationalist politics, right? And this has been a long-standing kind of debate in Muslim immigrant communities as well, with communities whose national sovereignty is under threat. So, for example, one of the things I kind of mentioned in the book is this tension for, Palestinian American youth who were in spaces that were emphasizing national sovereignty, self-determination, but were also in spaces emphasizing Muslim civil rights. And so I think the internationalizing of certain issues as kind of Muslim causes, creating a circuit, linking Palestine with Chechnya, Bosnia, or, China, the Uyghurs, is something that has been an ongoing subject of debate, right? But I do want to point out there were young people I talked to who were really engaged in both simultaneously. And they definitely were engaging in discussions and debates and encountering, tensions in each of those spaces for being involved in the other. But they were moving between them and trying to have this kind of complex interplay of acknowledging that there was obviously anti-Muslim racism, and a need to come together as Muslim Americans finally, but also that there were issues around nationalism and self-determination, racism, and so on.
So you mentioned that that there are, you found that a lot of them were engaging in both in religious and ethnic and sort of civil rights, and just in dipping into all of these different areas of activism. And I wanted to transition a little bit and talk about what you're seeing as activism looks like on college campuses. I wanted to, I know you work a lot with students on campuses around the country, and helping with guiding some of the activism and working with them. So what do you think are the unique challenges of activism, in particular for, our South Asian, MENA, and SWANA students?
Yeah, Omar, what has really struck me, and it's really heart-wrenching for me, is how much fear and anxiety there is among students, just to be honest about this, because I know that you have created a really wonderful community there at UC Riverside, and I applaud you for doing that, for even having this center, for your leadership, because it's not common. And I know students around the country have really had to fight to create spaces, to create the solidarity, because what I'm seeing with activism is that, and what I document in the book is a lot of concerns with censorship, with harassment, intimidation, blacklisting, surveillance. And so students, whose communities were under surveillance by state agencies, off campus, and who grew up with this kind of awareness that, their mosque might be infiltrated, or their student group might have an informant going on their field trip with them, which happened, right? It's all true. Also then went to campus and found that they were also then facing resistance to their organizing. And so what I've noticed in this generation, and, I'm sorry to say this, but I feel it's only gotten worse, is that, as the blacklisting has become more sophisticated and more devious, as there has been more harassment and lawsuits, that I think it's really created a chilling effect on campus. And so I've been faculty advisor, rather, to Students for Justice in Palestine on my campus for many years. And I'll be honest with you, and I think this should be made public. I don't think there's any secret around this. It's very hard for certain groups to recruit student members because, who wants to be on a blacklist and be worried that you might not get admission to graduate school, right? And so I think that is one issue. That said, Omar, I do want to point out that I've also seen the activism grow, become more creative, and actually become very powerful. And so I really want to recommend a book by Nora Barrows Friedman, who is a wonderful journalist on KPFA and writes for Electronic Intifada. And she did this book called In Our Power, which is about the student movement for justice in Palestine. And she has done numerous interviews with student activists from a variety of religious and ethnic backgrounds who are involved with the Palestine and BDS movement. And it is really, I think, one of the most powerful social movements on campus in the United States today. So I think that has been really incredible as well.
And what sort of, how do you think students should navigate and work through those challenges and those fears? What would you say to students who want to engage in these politics but are fearful of what the repercussions?
Yeah, I think that the best strategy is actually to be very public about one's politics and also be very strategic about having allies and thinking through, lines of solidarity. One of the things that, sometimes my own students ask me, I was teaching this class on student activism. They were like, Professor Maira, aren't you worried about being under surveillance? And do you ever worry about what you post on social media? And I was like, look, we all need to be very, kind of aware and very intentionally self-conscious about the fact that, there are people who are interested in tracking our activities and scrutinizing our speech. And so therefore we should proceed with that knowledge and then act accordingly. But I think staying away from it trying to avoid, speaking out about the issues one is passionate about or that one's family or community are impacted by actually doesn't necessarily help as a form of defense, because, one of the things we know is that, people can be targeted regardless of whether they're an activist or not. So I do understand that there's a privilege to being a US citizen, to having employment. I do know that students are vulnerable. Students who have, class concerns or immigration concerns are particularly vulnerable and can't often afford to take those risks. But I do think that, having a collective to organize is really important. And there are resources by now that actually can support and help and, defend students.
Thank you. And I wanted to just kind of start to the process, and I see Samaya actually already started us off with the question, but give people a chance to ask questions for Dr. Maira so that we have some time for you also. We can go ahead and get started. Dr. Maira, if you have anything else you wanted to share, we can just jump to questions.
Yeah, I actually really like Sumaya's question because it follows in what I was talking about. But I wanted to make just one point, Omar, this got lost in our sort of back and forth earlier, which is because it's relevant to what I was just talking about just now, which is that I think in terms of Islamophobia, it's also important to note that the war on terror and all of these counterterrorism strategies and programs were created by the US in many instances in collaboration with Israel. And so it's not a coincidence that the ways in which the term Islamofascism, for example, was coined, or the ways in which the profiles of Muslim communities and Arab communities have been created by police forces and intelligence agencies in the United States rest on a certain kind of Orientalist framework, an anti-Muslim and anti-Arab kind of framework that was developed by Israeli intelligence beginning in the 1980s. And so I think in terms of the methods that universities use to censor, discourage students in universities, one of the things that I'm going to say, because I think everyone here probably knows this already, is that the main line of argument to shut down activism by Muslim students in general, whether or not it's concerned with Palestine, is to make the allegation of anti-Semitism, right? So there's a kind of Orientalist assumption that Muslims are always already anti-Semitic. Again, it kind of invokes a religious framework, often when that is not even relevant to the issues that the students are discussing. But I think that the weaponization of anti-Semitism against Muslim and Arab and Middle Eastern activism is one of the most insidious responses and the university has been complicit with the state's kind of manufacturing of this accusation of anti-Semitism as a red herring to divert from the real issues of racial justice and militarism that students are trying to bring forth, including through divestment, which is what Sumaya is mentioning. Now, we all know that, the divestment movement spread like wildfire across UC campuses. And in every instance, the counter argument, which is a non-argument, in my opinion, was anti-Semitism. It was not a political argument. It was not a moral, it was just a shutting down of discussions by automatically blanketing any demand for human rights as being anti-Semitic,
I had a question.
I
This is Alton. Are we doing questions through text? Hi, guys. Sorry, I'm just coming in. Thank you, Doctor. Can we ask over line, or are we doing it through text?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, Doctor. Sunaina, I just noticed, I just came in, but I wanted to get some answers around supporting students if they're feeling like they can't share specific things about their situations in case management. But I like how you're talking about how this usually can get shut down by saying is that this is tied to the whole idea of Israel and all of that. So how, like, if as an ally, how would I support those conversations for students? Or there's things that I can indicate in my communication that would say that I'm looking at this as a neutral space when you meet with me, and we're not going to be looking at it from a political lens, because usually this political lens, as you're saying, kind of stops that conversation from moving forward, right? So any suggestions around that? Because that's one thing I want to do for my students when I meet with them.
Thank you so much, Alton. That's really wonderful. And I really appreciate your bringing that to the table and joining this discussion. I wish there were just tons of people like you everywhere. That's very thoughtful. So yeah, I mean, I think in my own conversations with colleagues, administrators, student affairs administrators as well, there's so many people who I think get concerned and also worried and frustrated by the terms of the conversation. I also notice, I want to be very candid and say that, at least in my campus, one of the things I've noticed on the other side is increasing anxiety and also sometimes a bit of distrust among students, not feeling safe, feeling that if they bring forth their complaints, this might only land them into more trouble. They'll be more in the bullseye. And so as a student faculty, kind of ally and advisor, I've also tried to walk this line between getting the students to be as public as possible about their experiences of harassment or bullying, or, doxing and intimidation, smearing, blacklisting, while also trying to protect them. And it's very complicated, right? Because one of the things that I hear from my student affairs colleagues is we can't help the students if they're not public. Like if they don't bring us the evidence, like how are we going to support them? And I see some of you nodding. So I know that this is a really tricky issue, because then the students tell me in confidence, look, we're so afraid. Like we're so afraid we cannot even report the data. And so one of the things that I think university administrators need to be mindful of is that in the case of this movement or this community, it is in fact the very, kind of nature of the complaint cannot even be made public sometimes. And so it's a unique quandary or paradox. And I think the way to kind of open up lines of communication is to let the students know their rights right away. I think if it is framed as a desire to protect their right to political expression, their right to academic freedom, and their First Amendment rights, in some ways, I actually think it's both educational for students. If you present that overture in their way, you're already educating them by telling them it's their right, but you're also signaling to them that they're protected. And, I spent a lot of time in the book tearing apart the idea of rights-based activism and talking about its liberal limitations. But that said, I mean, if we're in an institutional space where often lawfare is being used to shut down a range of progressive and social justice movements, not just related to, Muslims, Palestine, or the war, etc., then I think that's actually an important terrain. I also do think that the question of anti-Semitism is a very thorny one for progressive and left Jewish Americans. I mean, they are incredibly frustrated that anti-Semitism has been weaponized and trivialized in order to also further undermine their own ethical stance in relation to Zionism, which is a very complicated issue. And I know we might get to this later, but I'll just jump ahead and say that, the Trump administration and other administrations also before them have unfortunately tried to use, US state power to legalize definitions of anti-Semitism that are extremely problematic and that shut down political discussion by including criticism of the state of Israel in a definition of anti-Semitism when the two really need to be separated. And so we can talk a little bit more about that later if you want.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll go to Aya's question. It says, hi, Professor, have you observed some forms of activism to be more influential or likely to create change than others in your research?
Yeah, that's a great question, Aya. Thank you. And lovely name. Omar and I were just talking about that. But what I actually have felt both through my research and through my experience with students on my campus and in other campuses and in my own organizing is I think that the approach that is actually very important is a kind of intersectional approach that is able to create substantive connections to the struggles of other communities. And I say this not to suggest that one can never just talk about the experiences of, say, Palestinian Americans or Muslim Americans or Afghan Americans on their own terms, like by itself, as if that has no legitimacy if it's not connected to other communities. But it is to say that as if one builds those lines of solidarity through creating connections, one is actually advancing the movement, for justice for everyone, right? And showing how justice is indivisible. And so, for example, if we talk about the war in Yemen right now and the ways in which the US has backed the Saudi destruction of Yemen and created the world's worst humanitarian disaster, we might make linkages to the long-standing colonial policies in the region, which would connect Yemen to India and Pakistan through their experiences of British colonization. Or if we talk about drone warfare, we could make connections to East Africa and the droning, in Pakistan and Somalia and other countries. We could also, if we're talking about the wall in Palestine, make connections to the US-Mexico, border militarization and the ways in which family separation at the US-Mexico border is very much like the decades of family separation and restrictions and freedom of movement in Palestine. And so I think there's so many connections that people could be making through these lenses of, indigenous rights, freedom of movement, talking about basic human rights, that would help us strengthen our critique of US imperialism and white supremacy.
I see we have another question from Jack. Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for talking with us today. As someone who does not physically nor ethnically define with the Swana community, it feels a bit strange to participate in activism. How can I use my outsider identity to support the Swana community?
That's great. I really appreciate these questions. I think at some point we might even open it up and see if other people have thoughts on this, because, I'm a part of movement that includes many other people. But, my own feeling, and maybe you all others in the audience have other views on this. One is that to remember that even the term Swana, like there are some spaces in different communities that we're talking about today where that term would not even be legible. Like for some people in the older generation, they're going to be like, what is that? Like, is that a dish? Like, what are you talking about, right? So this is not to undermine the, political efficacy of that term or why it's so meaningful. And I actually think it's one of the most, in some ways, appropriate, right? But it's more that that there is, one could also just acknowledge going into a space and maybe people have uneven identifications with it, even if they're part of it. But I think that you're asking a question about allyship and solidarity in general. And I think a lot of those are sort of common responses that I might give. So I'd love to hear from others actually in this regard.
Hi, it's Toy Thibodeau, Assistant Director for the LGBT Resource Center here at UC Riverside. I would like to say one thing within that question is how can someone use their outsider identity to support a community or to be an activist? One thing I'm going to say is be that co-conspirator, be that true ride or die in those moments, to be the person who can use your outsider identity and your identity that's based in privilege to uplift a community that might not feel safe enough to do so in those situations, who might not feel safe enough to speak up when they see an act of violence or an act of intolerance or an act of bias. So to utilize your place of privilege to speak up for the communities that may not have that opportunity to speak up for themselves. I hope that's a little bit helpful, and I will stop from there.
That's excellent. That's exactly what I also would have liked to say, which is that, there are those who, like myself, have the privilege, of being, for example, a full professor, of not being, Muslim identified myself or from a Muslim family, who can use my, privilege and shield others, right, who are more vulnerable. And so I consider it my duty to do that, particularly as someone who is from the region. And I think that can happen across different, positionalities in different contexts. So.
Thank you, Toy. Thank you, Jack, for your question. And other questions folks might have? Trying to see if we have anything here.
One quick thing, Omar, I mean, I do want to actually hear more questions from the audience. Is you had asked a very important question, which was about how you can still be an activist without fearing for your employment or future opportunities, and what is the cost of the work. And I know I touched on it a little bit earlier, but I just want to elaborate on that very briefly in case students here might have those questions, which is that what I meant by saying that it's actually, more strategic to be public is I think that if people are worried about graduate school or employment, in some ways, it's better to have a record of your political positions. Like if that is on the record, then one can later make a case or a campaign if necessary that one was being targeted politically. But if one is secretive or private about one's political positions or expression, then you can't even make that defense, right? And then in any case, it's like you could get hanged for a sheep as well as a lamb. But I also think it's important in terms of making coalitions and creating like networks of solidarity. And so in that regard, I just want to drop a mention of a campaign that has challenged the blacklisting by Canary Mission, which I think the current generation has been severely impacted by, not so much the generation I write about in the book. So for those of you who don't know, this is an anonymous blacklisting site that was actually publicly posting profiles and names of faculty and students and activists who have criticized the Israeli state and participated in the BDS movement. And so, there is actually a campaign by group called Against Canary Mission that created a counter website in order to try to convert the stigma of that blacklist into a badge of honor. And this is, I think, really important that, claiming that there is actually, a source of pride in speaking out publicly in support of racial justice or against military occupation is so important so that we're not in the shadows all the time and so that we can create a community where we know one another. So just as the McCarthyist blacklist brought together people who then publicly decided they wanted to join the blacklist in solidarity with their leftist friends who were being targeted by McCarthy, we can kind of do the same, right? And I think it goes back a little bit to Toy's point earlier, which is that we can actually try to affirm the positions and the demands of those who are really struggling because they're more vulnerable.
Yeah, we actually had one of our students who worked at the Middle Eastern Student Center kind of targeted by Canary Mission, and they had contacted their place of employment and sort of just been blasting them on social media. And so I think that was just something that a lot of our students have seen and are very fearful of because like I said, it can impact their future and what they can what their career choices are, career goals. It has an impact. So I think it's really interesting how you say we're kind of flipping that, right? And saying that, almost turning it into a badge of honor and just being really, really transparent about it. And I think one of the things that has come up, and we'll wrap up in the next few minutes, and sort of slightly related to that, because I think that the recent sort of IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has come up a lot on our campus as well. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and why that can be so problematic for folks who may not understand, because a lot of times when it's presented, it's seen as sort of this, we should all be against anti-Semitism, but there's language behind that can make it, that's not as straightforward as people might think it is. And that's something that's come up. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about that definition and how that can be problematic.
Yeah, so the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Association has circulated internationally. So this was actually adopted in the UK first, and then it was adopted in the United States. And both, from discussions with colleagues in the UK and discussion, with people here in various movements who've been impacted by this definition, the problem is that it tried to codify a definition of anti-Semitism, some of which is appropriate, but some of which has drawn into the dragnet of the definition criticism of the Israeli state. So there are certain points that are listed there which would classify one as anti-Semitic if one was actually criticizing the government of Israel. And so expanding the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of a government's policies is incredibly problematic. And, the issue is that this has had state power behind it. So the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights had already tried to adopt this parts of this definition or a version of this definition in actually including anti-Semitism in the definition of Title VI, the basis for Title VI funding and freedom from racial discrimination. So there were about, I think it's Title VI, right, which is the Anti-Racial Discrimination Act. So basically, there were 3 lawsuits filed against different UC campuses claiming that that campus was anti-Semitic according to this definition, and there was a threat of losing federal funding, which also had a chilling effect for administrators and for student affairs staff. But in each and every one of those cases, those lawsuits were thrown out. And the courts found that, in fact, there was no evidence for the basis of racial discrimination, specifically targeting Jewish American students. We all know that there are also Jewish American students who are involved in the movement, for justice in Palestine. With the IHRA definition, again, it's created a lot of confusion. So a group of faculty, including myself, wrote a letter to the UC Regents who were also trying to adopt a version of this definition about 3 or 4 years ago. And there was in fact a lot of pushback across the UCs from faculty who objected to inclusion of criticism of the Israeli state in a definition of anti-Semitism. But there's a great deal of sensitivity, as you know, Omar, to questions of racism and anti-Semitism, as there should be. But weaponizing it, obfuscating it, actually does a disservice to the Jewish American community, because it also undermines the legitimate right of Jewish Americans, including of Israeli Jews, to criticize the Israeli government, right? I mean, so it's like, if we criticize the Chinese government for their human rights abuses, are we anti-Chinese? If we criticize the Russian government, are we ontologically like anti-Russian? If I criticize the Indian government, Hindu nationalist government, does that mean I'm anti-Hindu? That's a term that's hardly used in US mainstream discourse. Yet, there's an exception that has been created for Palestine, Israel, in which this is one of the few cases in which, criticism of that state can be used to actually deem that person racist and therefore silenced. And I think that really has to be disentangled. And if you're concerned about that definition, IHRA, or what we're discussing, you can go to the Jewish Voice for Peace website, and they have an excellent statement and document there on anti-Semitism that clarifies this. And this argument needs to be demolished. It's a red herring, and it's not a political counter argument. So the reason we have the IHRA definition, the reason we have Canary Mission, is because rather than having a political argument, there is in fact only this diversion, right? This red herring, which actually changes the topic of the conversation, and in most cases is also dishonest and disingenuous. So I think it's very important to counter that using the document that I mentioned, but also to kind of keep the focus on the issues of imperialism, settler colonialism, self-determination, and so on.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's been a big question for a lot of us, and I think you did just a really great job of explaining that and helping us to understand that. So the last thing I think we can leave with is just, what are some examples of activism and coalitions that people can take a look at for guidance? And so this will be, I think, the last question before we hop off. And Ali's made an announcement on the side, so please make sure you sign in, follow us at MESC UCR. And just make sure that you're taking a look on the side there to sign in and be eligible to get a book or a Target gift card. So Dr. Maira, could you tell us what are some places we can look to for examples of really strong activism and coalition building?
Yeah, I actually would really suggest, in fact, maybe use your Target gift card if you can. I suppose you can't really, but in any case, to get Nora Barrow's Friedman's book. I really want to plug Nora's book on the student movement for justice in Palestine, because it has such beautiful examples of coalition building and courageous activism by college students. And I think, she also has some interviews with students at UC Riverside or across the UCs for sure. And so for me, I think, it's just drawing on my own experience, my own political organizing. I think that the movement, including student activism, that has given me a lot of inspiration is the BDS movement. It's a movement that's happened, in your lifetime, while you were in college. I think this movement has really shown, what students can do to challenge university complicity with human rights violations, but it's also brought together such a diverse group of students. And I think what's really powerful about the BDS movement is it's actually rests on political principles. It's not an identity-based movement. It's really based, on the principles of racial justice and racial equality, freedom from occupation, freedom of movement, and the right of refugees. And I think these are such valid principles, including for our struggles for justice in the United States. It's become very clear to us here that, white supremacy, is actually a battlefield here that is still very, very contested. People are willing to take arms and to, basically, engage in assaults, on the government over here, over the future of this country in relation to white supremacy, as well as, the kind of ugly and sordid past of this country. And so it's very relevant to what's going on in the country right now.
Thank you for those examples. And can you type in the name of the author for us so that we can just make sure we check it out, or the name of the book, for folks that want to check it out? Oh, there we go. Nora Barrows Friedman. Once again, just want to thank you so much for joining us today, and just for taking the time to share your knowledge. I think that it's been really helpful for me personally in my sort of trajectory and in my education and my experience. And again, I think that I was so excited that you agreed to join us today and share your knowledge with us. So we're very thankful, and hope we can talk with you again soon, because I think that there's so much more that we can discuss, and we've only kind of hit a little bit today, but hopefully we can do this again soon. So thank you so much, Dr. Maira.
Thank you, Omar. There was a wonderful discussion, and all your questions were so thoughtful. And thank you for allowing me to have this dialogue. I really appreciate it. I don't get a chance to have this format very often. I'm so happy not to do another PowerPoint for you. And I really appreciated all your questions and comments. You're doing great work there. So keep it up.
Thank you so much. And once again, everybody, make sure you sign in. Follow us on Instagram at MESCUCR. You can check out the recording of this video on YouTube. And we will see you all soon. Have a good rest of your days, everybody. Good luck on finals.